The Cipher Brief, because national security is everyone's business.
For that, it's my honor to welcome three of my fellow SIG members. The Honorable Sue Gordon is the former Principal Deputy Director of National Security at ODNI, and she is currently an advisor at a number of private sector companies to include Microsoft. I think I saw Sue pop up. All right, there she is, or at least a scene of hers. She is joined today by Dmitri Alperovitch, the Executive Chairman of the Silverado Policy Accelerator. And this conversation will be moderated by Chris Krebs, who of course is the former director of CISA at DHS and now a partner and founder at Krebs-Stamos Group. Over to all of you. Thank you so much.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for the introduction. And Sue, Dmitri, great to see you again. So I think the conversation with Victor and Chris set us up nicely for a kind of a retrospective look at the last, we'll say 9 months to a year, and then looking forward, how do we apply some of the lessons learned from the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the situation with China and Taiwan, and potentially other areas of geographic interest and geopolitical interest globally. So let's start with just the, an expert's view of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, particularly how Ukraine performed. So what do we think? How do we think about how the government responded, reacted? Was we had the Lion of Kiev in Zelensky. Also, some of the innovation in tactics, in part due to Western training, but nonetheless, really applying modern technologies, drones, and other capabilities to the warfare to beat back Russia. And then lastly, hearing a little bit about what Victor mentioned with the cyber defenses within Ukraine, the defenders' adeptness and the ability to anticipate, prepare, and show a much more resilient posture. So, Sue, I think I'll start with you, just your take in general on how Ukraine performed, and then we'll go to Dmitri, and let's hold on any of the U.S. aspects, including some of the intelligence sharing for the next.
Yeah, okay. So Chris, Dmitri, anytime I get to be with you, it's a good day for me. Yeah, so I think you have to say that Ukraine is performing exceptionally against exceptional odds and in an exceptional circumstance. And there are probably lots of reasons for that. You said we'll hold a little bit on information sharing, but I think part is Ukraine's experience with cyber and with Russia's intentions. There's a lot of presaging of what Russia's playbook was in Georgia and Crimea in terms of shutting down power grids. So you have an experienced, in a way, Ukraine that imagined this. And we could have a fascinating discussion of whether the rest of the world really thought that it was going to unfold this way. I think one of the things you see in Ukraine is a preparedness nationally in their services and from a leadership perspective. I think what has been the most interesting piece, and Dmitri, I'd love your perspective on this, is just how flexible they have proven to be in using emergent capabilities to great effect. And we can talk a little bit later about all the commercial capabilities that have been used well and effectively, and what the impact of that is going to be, both positive and negative. But think about that. You're tactically not only taking advantage of new capabilities, but tactically putting them to use, I think, is a pretty impressive capability. And again, we'll talk about the role of training and participation and sharing, but if you just look at how they performed, I think it's a pretty impressive picture against daunting odds in a tough circumstance. What do you think, Dmitri?
Yeah, Dmitri, you've been kind of on top of this, right? Since what, November of last year? You were quite active on Twitter and anticipating, including putting down dates, kind of anticipating when the invasion would happen. And I think, you hit it pretty spot on. So again, let's hold on some of the information sharing and intelligence pieces, but just talk about for a moment, as Sue is teeing up, the innovation on the battlefield, the innovation in the information domain, and how this was such a surprising reaction, I think, to most in the national security community that was expecting Russia just to roll.
Absolutely, and you have to also appreciate how much Ukraine has advanced in the last 8 years. The Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian society, the Ukrainian political structures are light years ahead of where they were in 2014. And I think both the Russians and many Western experts that anticipated sort of a quick Russian victory here did that by and large because they looked at what happened in 2014, where Crimea, the units in Crimea surrendered without firing a shot, where Donetsk and Luhansk were taken over by insurgents with obviously Russian military support very, very rapidly. And there was a widespread collapse within Ukrainian military circles. So many assumed that the same thing would happen 8 years later. But of course, the Ukrainians took that time to adapt, to integrate Western weaponry, Western tactics, Western training, think through the defense of their country. They focused on really becoming a nation in the way that they had really not been since 1992. Their identity became much more of a Ukrainian identity. There's nothing that unifies a nation more than a confrontation with a major adversary, and that was obviously helpful. But I think to your original question, Chris, there are three things that the Ukrainians have and got that really contributed to their success. The first one is obvious, and that's just courage, the courage of their people, of their military, and their political leadership to confront these overwhelming odds and stay in and fight and not collapse, because this whole war would have looked very, very different if the political leadership had left the country, if Zelensky had actually taken the West up on its offer to get a ride out of Kiev into Poland or elsewhere in Europe. You likely would have had a collapse of Ukrainian defenses. And his famous phrase that first day of the invasion, that I need ammo, not a ride, was such a courageous, personally courageous call that unified the West in its response to confront this invasion, and obviously unified the Ukrainian people. The second is what Sue mentioned, the flexibility and the ingenuity of their forces, of their government on both defense and offense. You look at defense, the innovations that they've made on cyber that Victor just talked about, on offensive tactics, the employment, as you mentioned, Chris, of drones, including very cheap commercial drones from China, DJI and Alibaba drones that are now inflicting damage well in Russian territory, armed with kind of homemade explosives and other things that they're now using to hit key critical infrastructure in Russia. The use of drones for targeting artillery systems in a way that the Russians can't even match, which is really a big surprise of this war. And the third area of advantage, I would say, is their embrace and very effective embrace of friends and allies, both in the private sector and obviously Western governments, both in integrating intelligence rapidly into their targeting picture and predicting what the Russians are going to do. Obviously, having the Western intelligence apparatus, as we now know, contributing to the overall situational awareness picture that the Ukrainians have is invaluable, but also, in cyber in particular, leveraging the efforts of the big platform companies like Amazon and Microsoft and others, and companies like Mandiant and CrowdStrike and Dragos providing intelligence to cyber forces in Ukraine is really, really invaluable to them, and they're able to incorporate it very effectively to beef up their defenses. And that's something that they've done almost overnight, right? And you kind of wonder, if it were the United States government that was in a major conflict, how quickly would we adapt to the changing threat environment? Would we be able to do it within days, given our bureaucratic challenges? It's a big question.
Dmitri, listening to you, then just real quick, Chris, I'd add a fourth, it was a it is a very clever information war. Zelensky is using, and not just the cyber, but I'm talking about information in the oldest sense in terms of, it was a very modern approach. It was a very smooth approach. It was very responsive. And it's to your last point, Dmitri, I think it's another one where I think countries with a big installed base sometimes have a hard time getting out of how they did it in the past to embrace what is now available to us in order to be very effective.
And by the way, I just want to highlight a couple of things that they've done in terms of using OSINT. There was a targeting this week of a major Wagner Group base in occupied Luhansk region, and it was most likely based on the fact that one of the Wagner guys posted a picture of the base on, one of the reporters covering the Wagner guys, I should say, posted a picture of the base on Telegram with a partially unobfuscated address. The Ukrainians used that, found the location, and targeted with HIMARS, destroying the base and probably killing scores of Wagner Group companies. Just incredible ability to do what, as you know, Sue, we call F3EAD, find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, disseminate, doing that so rapidly that you know, it really is something that most intelligence agencies around the world would take note of.
Yeah, to the extent that the information awareness of how the Ukrainians are doing it actually reaches into the Russian, the fighting forces, there's a psychological dividend as well. You know, when you see these videos of the drones dropping munitions into open sunroofs in vehicles and, you know, vaporizing people, that's, you know, your head's on a swivel constantly in the battlefield with conditions like that. And to your point, the recent you know, whether it was the Telegram team that was running the channel that got wiped out by the HIMARS attack. I mean, it's pretty remarkable use of the information space to notch some wins, even if, you know, the numbers in and of themselves are daunting. So let's shift gears here for a moment and pivot over to the Western and specifically the U.S. intelligence services and how they declassified. And just to, you know, be very, very clear, I personally feel it's very important to give credit where credit is due. And so that's why we started talking about how Ukraine has individually and collectively performed here. This is not, you know, a win necessarily for the United States. This is Ukraine winning and us providing them support. So let's talk a little bit about that. And so you were in a position as the Deputy National Director of National Intelligence. And so you've kind of seen this ebbing in trend lines towards intelligence declassification. You want to talk a little bit about A, what happened here?
Sure.
Here,
well,
and B, again, trend line.
Yeah, I think in intelligence it's always a balance between protect and share, and I think historically the protect has dominated, and the sharing has occurred kind of after the fact. You know, when you know you're in a crisis and you know you're sharing. I think with the dawn of this digitally connected world, there's this growing realization that the threat surface is the private sector and the populace, and not necessarily our closest allies and partners with whom we have these, ingrained mechanisms to share declassified information. And so I think since certainly since 2017, with the intelligence community assessment on Russian interference in the election, you're seeing a growing trend toward more transparency, giving information in a timely fashion to the people who can use it in a manner they can use it. And so the decision to be very clear and very specific about what the intelligence community knew about Russians' intention, and even more than that, Russia's tactics, you know, it's the best day ever in intelligence when, to use a basketball analogy, you beat your adversary to the spot. And in this case, the timely sharing allowed, when the Russians employed certain tactics, we had presaged those, and so they weren't as effective as they might have been. So I think this is an arc the intelligence community has been on. I think it has to be judicious, but in this case, history will show and lessons learned will show that that was a pivotal moment when the community decided to share information of that specificity, of that intention at that moment.
So Dmitri, let's get your take from talking to experts like Michael Kaufman and Rob Lee, and just boots on the ground. How did it affect this release, this declassification in rapid, sometimes maybe even hours? How did you see that affect the fighting force of Russia?
I think, first of all, we have to recognize what happened here, starting with last summer and going all the way into the fall. There was a terrific story in the Washington Post yesterday, The Road to War, by our friend Shane Harris and the rest of the investigative team at the Post, that outlined just the extent of the penetration of the Russian state that our intelligence community was able to achieve, from military personnel all the way to political figures, where we knew precisely what the plan was going to be. Apparently, we even warned the Ukrainians that there was going to be an attack on Hostomel Airport, that famous airborne assault in the first hours of the war. The Ukrainians knew about it because we had advanced knowledge of that threat. We knew about the false flag operations that Putin was going to launch to try to justify the invasion. And by outing it well in advance, we basically removed his ability to create a pretext for the war, which helped to unify the Western world in its very strong and stark opposition to this illegal invasion. So we both, I think, have to recognize that this was probably, curious for your thoughts on this, Sue, but one of the biggest coups of IC history here in terms of acquiring this information, being able to analyze it and correctly predict not just an invasion would occur, but have all of the underlying details that we're able to understand and partially share with the Ukrainians and other allies, and two, actually impact Russian operations by disseminating either publicly or in more strategic ways, perhaps even potentially changing the course of the war. We'll see once the history of this conflict is written one day how much of an effect it had in those initial days. But the war for Russia was probably lost in terms of their ability to achieve their maximalist objectives in those initial hours and days of the conflict. And I do wonder how much that was as a result of the intelligence that we were able to provide to the Ukrainians. But then on an ongoing basis, you're absolutely right, Chris. When you look at the hit of the Moskva cruiser in the Black Sea, the flagship ship in the Black Sea, hit with Ukrainian indigenous missiles, Neptune missiles, there's almost certainly no way that they could have done that without intelligence provided by the United States about the location of that cruiser. The coordinates of ammo dumps and the like are most likely being supplied by Western intelligence as well. So probably on a daily basis, you have very significant operational intelligence and tactical intelligence that is being provided to the Ukrainians that they're able to then effectively use and counter the Russian aggression.
Yeah, just adding a couple points on that. One, I confess in a wholly biased fashion, I'm almost never surprised by the remarkable capabilities of the intelligence community. That said, I think if you trace post-Snowden, after some really significant damage to our capabilities, what is now being produced is remarkable. But I still think, Dmitri, that is often present. This recognition of how it needed to be shared, when it needed to be shared, with a partner that is not historically as trusted as some a priori, I think that will turn out to be the remarkable aspect, and the fact that the intelligence community does remarkable things all the time in terms of having information. But that decision to share at that moment in this environment so openly, because remember, they didn't just share with the Ukrainian military and leadership, they let it be known they were sharing. I just think that is we were talking about the Ukrainians using modern information tactics. That was a modern information tactic that I think.
Can I just ask real quick? I'm just curious for your thoughts on this. How much of our ability to collect this type of intelligence vis-a-vis Russia, which traditionally has been a very hard target, as you all know, how much of that has been sort of contributed by us being able to reduce our presence in the Middle East and kind of refocus some of the CT-focused mission people now on primary adversaries like China and Russia and improve our intelligence collection there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I'd been there for the past 3 years to have a good answer on that. I think whatever is being done in terms of prioritizing, for all the years that we were saying that we'd lost fidelity on Russia while we were doing other things, this is one of those quiet moments where there's going to be a lot of pride. In terms of
All right, we can talk Russia, Ukraine, I'm sure, for the rest of the afternoon, but one of the things that we need to close out here in the last 10 minutes or so is looking backwards. Let's also start looking forward. So this is obviously not the last geopolitical flare-up, flashpoint that we're going to see. I tend to believe that there are geopolitical issues along these lines that happen multiple times a decade. It's the response of the West and other allies that really differentiates, I think, this event with the NATO and others coming in support with intelligence and material. So let's look to China and the potential invasion of Taiwan. You just saw a pretty significant movement of force by the Chinese into the Strait, holding exercises a couple weeks back, coinciding with Speaker Pelosi's visit. I've talked to a number of folks in the national security community that are fairly convinced that something will come of a Russian or a Chinese invasion, rather. So, Dmitri, maybe I'll start with you. What's kind of from your perspective currently, Chinese designs on Taiwan and your forecast over the next couple of years? And then I want to talk a little bit about what business leaders need to be doing and thinking, preparing for that moment, which, unlike where with Russia, we maybe only had a couple months, we possibly have a couple year, a year or a couple years to prepare for the business and broader geopolitical implications.
That's a great question. I'm, just as concerned about the potential invasion of Taiwan as I was about the potential invasion of Ukraine back last December when I predicted it. I don't think it's likely in the next couple of years. I think the next probably 5 to 10 years is the window of maximum vulnerability. I think things actually get much worse for the Chinese once we get well into the 2030s and we're able to build up some of our capacity. You have the AUKUS deal starting to materialize in terms of the Australians starting to acquire advanced subs and other weapon systems we're providing both to Taiwan and the other allies in the regions that will make it much more difficult for the Chinese to invade. But in the next 10 years, and many people believe potentially 2027 as the next party Congress, where Xi is going to be 75 or so and maybe looking to retire and cement his record in many of the same ways that Putin is trying to put himself into Russian history as a great leader that consolidated lands that he believes are traditionally Russian, invoking Peter the Great, that Xi has the same desires on Taiwan. And what I fear right now is that the Taiwanese are much less prepared than the Ukrainians. Go back to my discussion of 2014 versus 2022. The Taiwanese are in many ways like the Ukrainians were in 2014, where they have not done the right things to beef up their military, to train their personnel for this fight. They have not acquired the right weapon systems, particularly asymmetric weapon systems, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, radar systems, and the like, that would make it much more difficult for the Chinese to get across. The other thing that's people need to realize is that the Ukrainians would not be able to keep on this war without materiel coming in through Poland and other countries into Ukraine. And Taiwan being an island, it's going to be much, much more difficult to resupply them, provide them with weaponry, or even just basics like food and other necessities that their population is going to need in the event of the invasion, if the Chinese are cutting off the island like they just practiced doing a couple of weeks ago. And lastly, what I'm very concerned about is that Putin in many ways gave us a gift. By virtue of mobilizing over the course of the year, the mobilization really, when you look at it, started in January, February of 2021. He spent all year mobilizing his troops on the border, giving us a very clear picture, not just the intelligence community, but many open source analysts like myself and Rob Lee and Mike Kaufman and others, a very good idea of what was coming. The Chinese are also going to need to mobilize, and it's going to take them time to mobilize. But now, by establishing this precedent of holding regular belligerent exercise in Taiwan, they may be mobilizing all the time. And we may not know if that mobilization that's taking place is just for an exercise or if it's really a buildup for an invasion. So we may not get as much warning as we did with Russia, knowing months in advance that this was coming with China. And I think those are the biggest concerns that I personally have around Taiwan.
Yeah, but I think to your point, we may not have that tactical warning, but we have strategic warning, right? We've got time or organization. So let's talk about the business community really quickly. You know, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there are obviously a number of sanctions that came down. Subsequent to that, even if you weren't touched by sanctions, there were still the broader war crimes. And, you know, Dmitri, I'll let you talk about your test in just a moment. But this was Russia, pulling out of Russia was an easy decision. We're talking single percentage points of global revenue. It wasn't a big as big a supply chain disruption as perhaps other countries. So let's look at how that's different with if China were to invade Taiwan, how the business community would be impacted, and what are some of the considerations they should be working through right now from a global markets perspective, from a supply chain perspective, from an IT operations perspective. And Sue, you know, you literally are kind of writing the textbook about this. You teach a course at Duke about national security for business executives. Can you talk a little bit about how you're viewing this problem right now and how you're talking to executives? You sit on a number of advisory boards. How do you talk about preparing and de-risking in anticipation of a China invasion of Taiwan?
Yeah, so I kind of do it at 3 levels, and I want to leave plenty of time for Dmitri because I want to hear what he says. 3 levels. Number 1 is I think 5 years ago, we collectively presumed we were living in a world of peace and abundance. And the combination of the pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine kind of blows that out of the water. So the first thing I would say with business community is look at the world in which we now live and recognize that there are adversaries, not just competitors, who actually on ideological grounds want to do things. And you just have to see that. And then the second is you need to start making some strategic decisions. We can talk about how effectively China, particularly much more so than Russia, uses our own system to enhance and support theirs. And they use our business systems, and they are thirst for investment dollars and our accessibility to technology, and they have used that. So you need to start thinking about what we are giving away and how you protect that. Now, this isn't a simplistic model because you can't just shut the door to China because we are intertwined economically, but we do have to be much more thoughtful about the risks you're taking, what is necessary, what industries we're giving away, who you're allowing to be decision makers, who you're allowing to own a part of it. So that's the kind of middle ground. And then the third thing is, well, I'm going to have 4 this time. The next thing is you need to decide on what your own ethic is about who you're going to do business with. And it isn't going to be as clear as it was here. There was a real good and evil. This is a much more intertwined thing. So you're going to have your own ethic, and there isn't going to be regulation or rule in advance of when you need to start making these decisions. They're going to be on your head. Who are you? What do you rely? What do you support? How are you making efficiency decisions that are going to affect, as I say, the larger issue of there are people, the ideological grounds to want to do harm to free and open societies. And then the last thing is just to engage your company and make your decisions about where you participate. And remember, part of protection is we need to keep running faster. Are we advancing our own capabilities? Do we have the best technology? Or do we have the best technology available for use? So that's my set.
Yeah,
Chris, let me actually throw this at you. Let me throw this at you, Chris, because I know that at Krebs-Stamos, you guys have done a lot of very specific advice to companies as they were thinking about pre-war and post-invasion, their operations in Russia. What are you advising companies right now at your firm with regards to China?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this last week in my talk at Black Hat, but companies need to, just like Sue said, need to establish who they are, what their principles are, what their values are, who they're willing to work with, and then conduct business according to that set of values and principles. You cannot make it up as you go along. When the moment hits you, you've got to have that plan. And that's the second piece. And Sue, you're talking a little bit about this as well, but look forward. The critical thing about China and Taiwan right now is we have time, we have strategic time. So you can look at your operations, your dependencies, your market entries, and you can start de-risking your operations. That's a lot of what we're seeing right now is, and I was frankly quite surprised by how many organizations did not have the ability to completely isolate the Russian geography, right? You couldn't just shut it off. There were a number that still hadn't perhaps learned the right lessons from NotPetya and not seeing, geographic granularity on network operations. So we're seeing a lot of companies that at the board level and the executive level said, oh, wait, geopolitical conflict is real. Oh, what's next? China. I'd also be looking at the global south. I'd be looking at Brazil right now with what Bolsonaro is doing with his election, trying to sow and undermine confidence. You could have a similar sort of event happen down in Brazil, but nonetheless, look at what your IT operations are. De-risk as much as possible through various types of whether virtual or physical segmentation. Diversify supply chains. But the last question, actually, I'm going back to you, Dmitri. What should the U.S. government do? CHIPS Act, good start. What's next?
Well, funny you mentioned CHIPS Act. Semiconductors, as you know, Chris, is many people call it the new oil. I actually think it's a misnomer because, as we now see, there are alternatives to oil. There's no alternatives for semiconductors. They're essential to modern economy, to the production of any modern good, all the way from weapon systems to microwaves and fridges and the like. This is the one probably last area of leverage we still have vis-a-vis China. They have not been able to master production of this technology. They need US and other Western tooling to manufacture any semiconductor, not just the most advanced ones, which I think we're a little bit misguided by focusing so much on advanced chips. They're important, but guess what? No device gets built without power converters, without voltage regulators, and those are your commodity chips that exist. And to people that say, oh, we don't care about the commodity chips and we only focus on advanced chips, I would propose a hypothetical. What if every bolt in the world was manufactured in China? And to build up our own manufacturing of bolts would take many years and billions of dollars of investments. Like, we would be very concerned about that, right? Even as simple as something as simple as a bolt. That's what we're effectively doing by not focusing on legacy chips as much as we are on the advanced stuff, because nothing can be built without that. And all of the tooling, all of the equipment manufacturing is done in US, it's done in Japan, it's done in the Netherlands, and some of it is done in Germany as well. All allies that right now are selling all that equipment to China to help them build out their own industry and achieve independence on semiconductors, which they're not even hiding. They have the 2025 plan. Xi is making this one of his strategic priorities to remove his reliance on the West. Why are we allowing him to do that? Why are we helping him? It is such a myopic situation right now. There's a great story in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about how the Commerce Department has barely rejected any exports to China over the last 5 years, even though we have things that are on the prohibited list. We're giving exemptions left and right. So we need to shape up and really say, not that we're going to decouple fully from China, that would be disastrous for everyone and frankly probably lead to war. But on strategic areas like semiconductors, we absolutely need decoupling, and we need to make sure that we are reducing our reliance on both China and Taiwan, so that if, God forbid, something happens in that conflict, there is not a global recession or depression that happens as a result. And we just need to accelerate all of our efforts. CHIPS Act, a good step forward, but people have to remember it's only $52 billion. That's a drop in the bucket for what we need. Luckily, there's about $1.4 trillion in committed spending from both governments and industry over the next 10 years, almost all of it in the West. And we need to be very thoughtful with our allies and partners to say, okay, there's a lot of investment that's going to be in this area. Let's make sure we're not all chasing the same 3-nanometer logic fabs, because we have vast needs across the node sizes, memory, analog, etc. And we're doing sort of focused investments where Korea, you're really good at memory. Let's double down on that. Europe, you have great industrial production capacity, focus on chips that are needed for that. We have great expertise in logic. Let's do this smartly and friendshore as opposed to onshore, because onshoring will just not work in this global economy where a single chip during its course of manufacturing may traverse 60 borders before it's made.
Yeah. Well, it almost sounds like we need a industrial policy, right? And if only there were a policy accelerator looking at that. So, oh wait, there is, Silverado. All right, with that, back over to you, Suzanne. Thanks so much.
I can't tell the three of you what an honor it is to work with you as CIG principals at the Cyber Initiatives Group. And thank you so much, Dmitri Alperovitch, of course, Executive Chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, Chris Krebs. I think the founding director of CISA, now partner at Krebs-Stamos Group. Thank you, Chris. And my good friend, Sue Gordon, who I always feel like I've read about 5,000 papers by the time I just listened to you for 30 minutes. So thank you all so much for being here. And I appreciate you helping us advance this conversation at an expert level.
Thanks, Suzanne.
Thanks, Suzanne.